Hi everyone, and welcome to Towards 2040, a conversation series that we're now in our second conversation. If this is the first time you've joined us, this is a conversation series inspired by the 2040 film that came out recently. And what we're doing is picking out some of the themes in the film and going a bit deeper into looking at what's actually happening on the ground right now that's helping us towards that 2040 vision, and what are some of the things that are holding us back from that. My name is Amanda Carl. I run an organisation called The Next Economy, and I was involved in the film for the last couple of years. So it's my pleasure to just keep this conversation going a little bit more. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that if you're joining us, particularly anywhere in Australia, you're joining us on Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land, and that this land has never been ceded. I'm here on Turrbal and Yagara land, otherwise known as Brisbane. And I'd encourage everyone to look at, who the traditional owners of the land that you're meeting on, wherever you are today. Today we're going to be talking about energy justice issues. So renewable energy, of course, was a big theme in the film, but there's a lot of questions about how we actually get to that future where we've got 100% renewable energy. We can build it through private companies and do it really quickly. Government is investing in renewable energy. People are putting solar panels on their homes. There's lots of different ways we can go about it. But I want to talk about how we do that in a way that everybody benefits and nobody gets left behind as we're going through this massive change to our energy system. And to join me in the conversation, I have three amazing people that I highly admire. The first, we're going to hear from Giles Parkinson. Giles is the editor of a really great online news outlet called Renewable Economy. If you haven't signed up already, I'd really encourage you to, because they stay on top of all the energy issues in Australia. So you should see free. Giles, and it's free. And it really is. They get the best people writing for it. We've also got Nikki Ison, who just did the thumbs up. Hopefully everybody can see. Nikki wears a number of hats. I know her mostly as a co-founder of the Community Power Agency, and they support groups all over Australia building community-owned energy groups. But she also works for the Climate Action Network of Australia, which is a peak body for climate groups. And she's also affiliated with the University of Technology Sydney through the Institute for Sustainable Futures. So she's a very busy person. And finally, we've got Larissa Baldwin meeting with us as well. And Larissa is from the Widjabul clan of the Bundjalung Nation in the Northern Rivers area, if you're not familiar with that. And Larissa is a lead organiser with Get Up, but she has a long history. She's also was a co-director of SEED, that's an Indigenous climate action group, and also worked for the AYCC as well. So these guys are the best people to be talking about energy justice issues, because they're working on the front line, but also have that big picture view of what's actually going on. As we go through, hopefully you should see all four of us. There's a little icon up the top in the menu section where you can change the view of who's speaking. So you can either look at all of us, or you can choose just to look at who's speaking at each time. And also on the little menu bar, there's a little questions icon. So as we go through and you want to ask a question, and we encourage you to, please open up that little chat box and put that in. And the lovely Bree Whiting is helping us manage those questions. So each one of these guys is going to talk for about 10 minutes, hopefully, and then we'll try and have 15, 20 minutes for your questions at the end. All right, let's get started. So Giles, I'm pretty sure that most people, hello, I'm pretty sure that most people on the call know the urgency around us needing to peak our emissions, and that really means getting to 100% renewable energy as quickly as we can. And there's so much misinformation out there about where we're at in Australia about that. So where are we at? Are we on track to do it within a time frame that we need to, or not?
Well, yes and no. If we actually just think about the last couple of years, we're actually installing wind and solar at a rate which would be the rate we basically need to get to 100% renewables by 2030 or the early 2030s. And the reason why we're doing that is thanks to the renewable energy target, which Labor put in. The coalition tried to pull down, they couldn't, and that's provided the incentive for people to build lots of wind and solar farms. Plus, that's now being supported by state-based targets and, interestingly, corporate demand. and of course household and business demand, because there's lots happening in rooftop solar as well. So right now we're at about 22.5%, I think, for the last 12 months. And with the current build that's been done for the renewable energy target and some of the state-based schemes, by the end of 2020, we'll probably be at about 28%. Now, what happens after that is really kind of up in the air. There's going to be more built out. The forecast is that, just with rooftop solar and some of the other corporate demand and the state-based schemes, we're going to get pretty close to 50% anyway by 2030. But what we've seen over the last couple of years, because of the amount that we've actually seen built, we could actually get much further than that. And hopefully we will. What it requires, though, is planning and infrastructure, and just really, unfortunately, for the best we can hope for this government is just basically get out of the way and allow the institutions like AEMO and other people to get on, modify the rules to cope with wind and solar, make sure that the infrastructure and the extra transmission and other things need to be built in there to support it, that the storage comes in at the same time. Because as you get over 50% renewables or towards it, then you obviously do need storage. One of the things I find really gratifying and uplifting, and I can't emphasize the importance of this enough, is what's happening in South Australia. So South Australia is already, thanks to the Labor Party policies, is already now more than 50% wind and solar, and it's heading towards 100%. The Labor government lost power a couple of years ago. The Liberal government came in and they're going, okay, this is okay, we're happy with this, we're comfortable with this, and they have now set a target of 100% net renewables by 2030. Now,
Wow.
that means that they're going to be generating more wind and solar than they actually need. They hope to be building a new link to New South Wales. They'll be exporting into New South Wales to excess. They're getting about building more storage. For them, a major economy with major steelworks, major mines, other major manufacturing businesses, from a Conservative government talking about 100% wind and solar, with storage, with some gas that will remain there for a while, but maybe phased out later. That's extraordinary. That's like this world leading. It kind of defies all that rubbish that you hear on the, in the newspapers and politicians. So that's really quite exciting. And if they can do it, then there's absolutely nothing stopping the rest of the country.
Yeah, I was at a meeting in Canberra this week about transition and transitioning to the energy system. And somebody put up a graph and said, well, the last 3 days, South Australia's hit 100% renewable energy for 3 days straight. So we're talking about 50%, but actually there's days when it's actually much more than that. And that's important for people to hear, because I think that with this government, it means nothing's going to happen, but actually we're already achieving the targets that they were setting. And there is a momentum there that we can build on. It's just the coordination, how messy it's going to be, I guess.
Yeah. We do need to go faster than what will probably happen in the next 10 years. And it's really unfortunate that we have a government now that's not going to help it. What we can hope is that they don't get too far, too much in the way.
So what can we do then, if people are sort of saying, well, what can I do to influence the government? What's your suggestions or advice?
Keep pressure on the local politicians. And I think we're going to get into some of the other details later on in this call. But if you haven't already put rooftop solar on the roof, do so. If you, and Nikki can talk about this much more cleverly than I can, but if you're involved in the community, if you're a renter, if you're living in an apartment, then you should be pushing, putting pressure and finding out more information about how those people can be linked in too, because they've kind of been the missing link. But now we are finding new ways, and basically it comes around to smarter ways of thinking about, how we connect things and how we sort of package up bills and stuff like that. So it's not, now we know basically how to make it easier for renters and people in apartments and other people to get solar and in communities. And it's just a matter of going out and doing that. And, some of that's not just about technology. A lot of it's actually about breaking down the rules, because like the rules have all been set. There's a big coal-fired power station, there's a big gas station, you're a customer, that's it. Now it's two ways. As we've seen in 2040, it's about sharing energy. This is as much about changing the rules and the institutions that govern that as it is about technology itself.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. So in the film, they talked about microgrids, and we saw that example in Bangladesh with, people having small battery packs and then being able to share and trade energy as they wanted to. Can you just explain a little bit more about how microgrids work?
Well, it's basically one house has a solar panel, and it probably connects it into its own house and powers its appliances, be it a fridge, a telly, or a couple of lights. In those houses, it's probably the minimum amount. But let's say someone gets more than they need. So what do they do with it? They either store it in a battery, or maybe they can start sharing. So you build a line to the next house, and somebody else might have solar, and you all start linking together. And basically, you're building a grid from the ground up. And what we're seeing now, and we're thinking about a lot of, there's still 1 billion people, or maybe it's down to 700 million or something like that, people in the world who don't have electricity, aren't connected to the grid, or just don't have electricity. So how do we bring that to them? Well, we can bring the Western style thing of these really big grids and sort of bring it down and distribute it that way. But that's kind of a really expensive way of doing things. And what they're finding now is that it might be just as effective to build from the ground up. So in those areas in Bangladesh, you can't afford to wait for the government to get their act together. They're putting in solar, they're stringing wires between houses, they're putting in batteries, they're putting in smart controls, and they can basically share that electricity towards them. And that effectively is what a microgrid is. And a microgrid can actually be separate in a new thing like that, or it could actually be within a city that's already grid connected. It can be in a community at the edge of the grid, or not connected to the grid. There's lots of different ways a microgrid can be thought of, but basically that's it. It's just people based around a local generation supply, sharing, using smart technology, using storage, and not being relied on not reliant only on a centralized output.
Yeah, it's actually, I was in India in 2009, 2010, and I was seeing these systems getting set up, and it's actually what got me into climate action in the first place, because I was seeing large scale wind and solar projects in India, as all these small systems in informal settlements and really remote communities, and I was like, why aren't we doing this here? Microgrids we're not actually doing in Australia yet on a large scale. There's been a couple of trials, haven't there? But what's the situation with microgrids in Australia?
There has. Look, it's one of the major things that in Australia, basically we've got a centralised grid and all the rules are around that. And the whole grid is defended or controlled by large utilities, be they networks and generators and retailers, and they're defending their patch. But we're now starting to break down the rules and break down that resistance. And basically it's because of technology and cost. So in the last couple of years, we've seen some trials and some experiments about, well, rather than paying this extraordinary amount of money to have a string of wire going 1,000 kilometres over Western Queensland or in WA, might it not be cheaper to actually just sort of take that community, be it one house, 5 houses, or a whole town, and actually just take them off the grid, give them some local solar, give them maybe a backup generator, give them some storage, give them some smart software, and they can actually look after themselves. And it is so much cheaper. But to break down the rules and to allow that to happen is just almost impossible. And finally, the rule maker has come down and said, okay, let's do it, pave the way. They've kind of stuffed it up in a way which is not worth going into now, but they've made it more difficult than it needs to be. But finally, they've actually done it. And if you think about a grid in Western Australia, which is really interesting because it's got a lot of wind and solar coming in there, but they're quite isolated. They're not connected to anybody else. It's not like South Australia, which at least has one connection to Victoria. They're kind of all there by themselves. And they've got this grid and it goes around, and the guys who actually operate that grid say, look, it'd be actually much smarter if we actually just make this a modular grid. So we take these guys off the grid, we take these guys off the grid, we give this one a microgrid here, and we give them like a really thin wire just to sort of as a bit of a backup. And that is just going to be so much more effective and so much more cheaper and use all the resources that we have. And they're really excited about that prospect. Probably a few more hurdles to get over yet, but that's the way I think we're going to head. Even the major people like AEMO, Australian Energy Market Operator, whose responsibility it is to keep the lights on, they say, well, look, the most reliable way of the future is basically local generation and microgrids. And they see a future along with CSIRO and even the networks where within a couple of decades, half of our power will come from local communities because it will be generated in a house, generated by a business, generated in a local community-based solar farm or wind farm or whatever. And that's basically going to be formed around microgrids. So it makes sense now to where you've got that local generation, you put a bit of storage in there, and you might be connected to the grid, but it might be a thin connection, or it might be no connection at all, or it might just be part of the overall thing. But that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to make it more resilient, which is really important as we go into climate change. We've got hotter weather and bigger storms. It's going to make it more reliable, and it's going to make it cheaper, and it's going to make it cleaner.
Mm. And potentially more just as well, depending on how that's set up and whether you're talking about communal sharing or individual sharing. Because individual sharing could just be like the normal kind of capitalist model where it's just energy that's being traded for a price, or it could be set up in more of a communal kind of way, I guess.
I think there's a lot more chance for it to be share when it's local and communal and distributed than when it's centralized, simply because there's not the control. I mean, what we're paying for electricity now is just absurd. And look, that's been the case for 5 or 6 years and just keeps on getting more and more absurd. Basically because the incumbents are so desperate to defend their patch and so desperate to make as much money out of the existing model as they can while it still exists, because they all know that it's going to change. They're not too sure exactly what the future looks like. They're not too sure how exactly they play that role there. So they've got their ears pinned back and their bums up, and they're just ploughing in there and making as much money as they can. Unfortunately, the people who are losing out are the consumers, and particularly the most vulnerable consumers. And I think a lot more attention should be paid to their plight, because there's answers now that we could and should be doing, but we kind of get stalled by the overall sort of inaction in policy.
Yeah. Well, one way forward, I'm going to move on to Nikki and get her to talk about the work that she's doing, because that's sort of taking that step further in terms of communities getting organised around owning their own energy through community-owned renewable energy projects. So, Nikki, can you explain a little bit about how community energy works? Because it's lots of different things, isn't it? It's not just
Yeah,
one model.
absolutely. Lots of different things. Community energy is as different as the communities that exist across Australia and around the world. The way we talk about it is community energy is where people come together to develop, deliver, and benefit from clean energy, and that could be through developing a community-owned renewable energy project like a solar farm or a wind farm. It could also be through looking at the demand side and looking at how we can reduce our energy needs through energy efficiency. And it could even be coming together to look at how we could sell electricity. So we're starting to see community-owned retailers as well. So it's about communities getting in on the energy game and making sure that the energy system of the future benefits their community.
Can you give us an example of a really successful community energy project?
Oh,
Just
there's
in
so
case
many.
people are really new to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So community energy really started out of Denmark and Germany and Scotland. In Australia, we've been doing community energy in a big way for about last 8 or 9 years. There's now 105 community energy groups. When I first started looking at this a decade ago, there were 5 community energy groups. So, this is really taking off. But let's talk about the pioneering project, which is Hepburn Wind. So Hepburn Springs and Dalesford are a community in central Victoria, a very beautiful part of the world. A guy called Per Bernard, Danish guy, was living in Hepburn Springs, went to a meeting about like 50 kilometres away around a proposal for a new wind farm, and he was shocked by how many people thought that was a bad idea. This was about 2005.
The wind project, that is.
The wind project, because there was quite a lot of backlash to wind projects, and where he was from in Denmark, communities came together to develop and own these wind farms. So we went, well, why can't we do that right here? And so he got a group of people together, normal community people, and went, hey, can we do this? And then he got his card table out and he sat it in the middle of Dalesford for about 3 years and got people interested and excited. They worked with a small community developer, and 6 years later, the community had raised $10 million in community investment and grant funding, and they built a 2-turbine wind farm that's owned by a cooperative of 2,000 members, the majority of whom are local to the Hepburn and Dalesford community. They've done some great things. So one of the early things that they did was went out to the local primary school and did a naming competition. So the kids have named the 2 turbines. The winning names were Gusto and Gale. After that, they've raised some money and they've actually painted murals on the side of the wind turbines, Gusto on one turbine, Gale on the other. They have community days and use the space, and it's on a local farmer's land, and they run sheep and cattle next to the wind turbines. But now they're looking at, well, what else can they do? They're looking at local hydro. They're looking at doing a big community-owned solar array. They've been helping their community to do more energy efficiency and rooftop solar. So it's really become a hub project for so much more. And it's also inspired people, not only just around Australia, but around the world. You know, they've won international awards. Yeah, so that's sort of, you know, the flagship community energy project in Australia, and really amazing one. But there are other communities just doing simple things like fundraising to put solar on the local childcare. You know, this doesn't have to be something where you have to raise $10 million. This can be something where, you know, a group of people come together and fundraise a couple of $1,000s to put some energy efficiency and solar on the childcare roof.
So often, like when people talk about community energy, they use words like democracy and justice. So how are these projects any different? Like, how do the benefits actually flow back to the community? Like,
yeah,
what,
so
how does it change?
So I think we talk about the 4 Ds of community energy. Community energy projects decarbonise, decentralise, democratise our energy system, and demonstrate what the energy system of the future could look like. And the way they do it, that is, you know, by these projects being driven by local people for the needs of the local community. So, you know, in some communities it might be that a lot of people are renting or living in apartments. So that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. In other regional communities, that's not a problem at all. But, you know, there's a lot of agricultural biomass and waste that needs to be dealt with, or, you know, there's a new transmission line being developed, and how can the community benefit from that? So like different communities face different challenges and different opportunities. So these projects are driven by local people for the benefit of local people, and that benefit often equates to a renewables project being owned by local people, and so you put some money in and then you get a return on your investment. So it's a local investment, and if you think about it, you know, you send anywhere between $500 and a few $1,000s out of your community every year in electricity bills. So what can we do to keep that money going out of your community in electricity bills actually circulating in your own community? The folks in Yakandanda, also in Victoria, are a great example, and they've set up community and microgrids in partnership with a technology provider, and are now looking at doing a community-owned retailer. They're not the first. Enover in the Northern Rivers, near where Giles lives, has set up the first community-owned electricity retailer. So it's about how do you start to innovate in this energy system, because there are so many incumbents out there trying to defend their patch, and we need to be creating the new ways of doing things that really, you know, don't just benefit the large investors and don't just benefit, you know, multinational corporations, but benefit the communities where renewable energy will be located. There was something that I wanted to share, actually, which is why I got into this and how it happened for me, because I think it's useful in thinking about energy justice and energy democracy. So when I was an engineering student at UNSW about 15 years ago, I listened to a talk. I went to a forum by a guy called Hermann Scheer. He was a German politician, and he talked about renewable energy as fundamentally different from fossil fuel-based energy. And that was really exciting to me, because one of the things that is really different, like if you think about fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil, also nuclear, it's about digging up stuff, the fuel, coal, gas, oil, and then burning it. And so what you really have is a market of fuel. Whereas with renewable energy, the fuel is free. It's the sunshine, it's the wind, it's the water. But what you have is a market of technology to harness that fuel. And those technologies, wind turbines, solar panels, are so much more modular. They can be as small as, you know, having a small solar panel to, you know, light, you know, when you're doing your homework, to a 10 gigawatt solar array in the middle of the Northern Territory. Like, you know, this is small to really, really large. And that means that everyone no matter where they live, no matter how much they earn, can actually participate in the energy system and directly benefit from it. You know, if you have more money, you're going to be able to benefit from it more, which is why we need to be putting in place energy justice-based policies to rectify some of those injustices and ensure those people that are most disadvantaged aren't left out. And that's a lot of the work that we do at Community Power Agency. But the technology itself creates the opportunity for a more democratic energy system where communities can come together and actually build and deliver and benefit and own and, you know, earn income from renewable energy projects in a way that they can't with a large coal-fired power station.
And yeah, and it's interesting talking to people who are starting these projects. It's not just the, well, I buy into it, therefore I get a return as an individual. There's generally community funds that are set up with some of the profits to make sure that that money is invested in different things, not just to set up more energy projects. But also people talk about that's the first opportunity they felt that they've had to really come together and learn democracy skills. Like they have to make decisions together about infrastructure, which is big. So it's actually, a lot of people talk about how stronger their communities are because they've had to come together and work together and figure it out instead of just individually paying a power bill.
And it's a bit like, you know, you think about community gardens or food cooperatives. They're examples of enterprises that are much more democratic, but they're still relatively simple. Whereas if you're talking about, you know, a wind farm or a solar farm, that's, you know, some substantial infrastructure. So you need to learn how to work together to manage something bigger. And it really is about taking back control. You know, communities taking control over their energy future. You know, we have a rooftop solar revolution, which is about households taking back control, but let's take it to the next level and, you know, not just act as individual households and consumers, but as citizens in our community, taking back control at a community level.
Great. And if people want to learn a bit more or they want to start a project, where should they go to get more info?
My organisation, the Community Power Agency, we have a map of 105 community energy groups across Australia on our website. It's cpagency.org.au/map. So that's a good place to go and see if there's a community energy group near where you live. If not, my suggestion is you get together with 3 or 4 friends and see if they're interested in doing a community energy project. You go and have a look at some of the resources on our website and then give us a call and we can help.
Great. And I'll put everyone's organisation's links up on the website where we put the recording of this call as well. Thanks. Larissa, so you do some really amazing work. Like I'm totally in awe of you because you've been really working on the front lines in a range of different Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, dealing with different kinds of issues around energy. And so I just want to open this up with what you think energy justice looks like based on the work that you've been doing.
I think for me it was like coming on board when I first, you know, at high school learning about climate change, and then you see the maps of where the temperature maps of like what it could look like if we did nothing and what it would look like at this levels of warming. And I remember looking at those maps and seeing like, if this happens, then this means a whole bunch of our remote communities and a whole bunch of people that live in remote areas are not going to be able to live on country anymore. There's nothing special about First Nations people that allows us to live in extreme temperatures and that sort of stuff. So to me, that was why climate change is important, and people have to know why it's important for Aboriginal people as well. And I felt like such a coming into the climate movement, trying to have those conversations, it was a very different reception that I got from a bunch of people. Like a lot of people care for a lot of different reasons, but I think that was why it was so important. It was so important to me to set up spaces where we had not just like the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network, but in our campaigns that we really create big campaigns that frontline communities are leading. Because it's not just about the impacts of climate change for First Nations people in this country or in many places around the world. Like we know the impacts are will be disproportionately felt. They are being felt already. But in this country in particular, like when you look at the, you know, Australia is the largest exporter of coal and gas in the world. We overtook Qatar a couple of weeks ago, and that's pretty crazy. But in terms of extraction, 60% of the mines in Australia are in close proximity to remote Aboriginal communities. So there's just the causation of it and the extraction, it is also our communities that are feeling the impacts of that. And seeing just last week, the Northern Territory government, I've been working on a fracking campaign up there for nearly 5 years with communities right across the territory working together. But they just put in a whole bunch of no-go zones, and they said, 49% of the territory is going to be off limits, and basically they took off all the densely populated areas. And then if you actually look at the maps that are open for fracking, it's like remote Aboriginal communities are right in the firing lines with these like really tiny arbitrary kind of buffer zones, but their water and everything around there, like they're going to be inundated with the fracking industry. And so there's stuff like that. It was just like people just, they don't think about that in terms of like, oh, that's a lot of people, but Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, they make up nearly 40% of the population, and over 80% of them live in very remote communities. So it is our communities that are going to face the impacts of fracking in the territory. So there's the extraction side of it, but then it's when you get real about the climate impacts that we've already locked in, we're seeing over the last 5 years this increased intensity of like wet seasons across the north of Australia. It's looked like places like Elcho Island being left without powerful weeks. Just recently this year, we had basically the whole Gulf, the remote communities in the Gulf were evacuated. They're not evacuated because they're evacuated because there's inadequate housing there. So we're talking about, people think about Aboriginal housing, think, oh, there's not enough housing to go around. But actually, the reality is that in remote communities, people are living in basically shanty towns. Like people are living under tuffs. So when we have these extreme weather events, it's unsafe because there's all this debris that can fly around. That's why all these communities are evacuated. So something like that. And then I think that in Arnhem Land they had this year as well, where a lot of communities are on basic cards or income management. And because all the power went down, whole communities were unable to access their basic cards and that sort of stuff. So they're not able to buy food. So it's like the climate impacts that are already happening in this country are severe for remote communities. Not just remote communities, but I would say more generally across the north of Australia, we've locked in a lot of climate impacts already. And I think that our communities are least able to adapt. The infrastructure investment hasn't been made. People look at maybe in 2014, 2015, you might have remembered the forced closures and that sort of stuff. And that's about the long-term viability of these communities. They're expensive to run. And governments are not investing money into the infrastructure of them. So it's like, if they're not going to do that, there's a reason they're not, like there's massive reports that have been done into what it looks like long-term in these communities. But climate change plays a role in that. And it's not just that we don't have enough housing in remote communities to deal with housing people. It's also like for climate adaptation, what they're actually looking at is needing to scrap a bunch of the housing there and rebuild completely to have adequate housing. So I think it's that. But then also, working in the territory, it was one story. We went out and surveyed a bunch of communities in Borroloola, Robinson River, and the remote outstations around there with fracking. And Borroloola became the first Aboriginal community to declare itself gas field free. In that, we did a bunch of talking about renewable energy and solar and what people thought of it. And one of the things that we discovered, which is really shocking, is that people are like, oh yeah, we definitely think it's cleaner, but it's not cheaper. I was like, why is it not cheaper? So we surveyed 1,000 community members out there. And what we found was that the model that's set up in remote communities is it's diesel powered generators backed up by solar energy. So these communities are still spending $1 million a year to power their communities with diesel, which is just ridiculous. And at the same time that people in actual houses out there are spending like $30 a day on a power card, which is ridiculous and is not sustainable, but this is the model because governments are really failing at putting in really the right kind of policies in communities. So you end up with these ridiculous solar diesel energy mixes, which aren't sustainable and really expensive. So, yeah.
That's insane, isn't it? I mean, I remember meeting with a minister, I won't say which government, 5 years ago, and they were saying, well, okay, we want to do something proactive, and it'd be easy for us and it'd be a good win to start getting renewable energy projects on country in remote communities because the diesel just costs so much money and it costs the government a lot of money as well. So why isn't this happening? Why haven't we seen that rollout? Because I know that different groups have been trying to get renewable, especially solar projects up and running in remote communities. What are some of the issues around that?
I think the issue is that the policy is just set policies are set down in Canberra and they don't actually understand how they're rolled out in communities. So it's like in a lot of remote communities, the training's not there for, you know, places like we talk in Marbinji, which is the Aboriginal organisation there, and they're unsure, how do we access like the ability to be able to build these sort of things. Is kind of the reason that the First Nations Renewable Energy Alliance came to being, because it was just like, there's a bunch of stuff that could happen in renewable energy, but we don't know how to access the funding, we don't know how to access the model. And the government's not taking it out there with a roadshow being like, hey, let's transition, because at the same time, all this extraction is happening next to their communities, and they're promising these communities these jobs. Your jobs are going to come from mining. This is a story they've been telling, not even remote Aboriginal communities across the country for decades. And we know from the reports that hasn't eventuated. So there's like a vested interest there about why it hasn't happened. Like even down in Yendamu. So Yendamu has big gold mines beside it, which is, you know, obviously I'm talking about climate and fossil fuels, but there needs to be a gas pipeline to expand the mine in Yendamu. So now they've gone around door to door in the remote community and said, hey, if you expand this gold mine, which the community hates, we'll give you a gas pipeline, and then you're going to have reliable energy. So it's also like everything comes as a plus to doing other mining and stuff like that. It's never talked about, well, this is what you need. We need energy security. We need to break away from the energy poverty that's here. It's never that. It's always leading with, well, we want something else from you. I think that we really need to get real about what adaptation and mitigation. And I think for the climate movement more generally in this country, people are talking about mitigation, but we've locked in a lot of impacts already. And for our communities, we have to talk about mitigation. There's some brilliant stuff happening. Oh yeah, adaptation. Some really brilliant stuff happening in the Kimberley Land Council is running this savanna burning program. You know, burning off during the cooler seasons and protecting country when it's like, you know, we've had the big mega fires, wildfires ripping through there and that sort of thing. And they've developed a program which are now actually going into places in Botswana and stuff like that and teaching them how to do fire controlled burning and stuff like that. But that took a lot of work from the Kimberley Land Council to change the rules under Indigenous protected areas, to change what kind of funding could come in from IBA, all this sort of stuff. They met with, I think it was Minister Hunt, like there was some significant change, which that if you had just some sort of, you know, CSIRO scientists being like, this is how you do it, was actually one of the land councils going to be like, we have to do this and this is what we need to change in the law in order for us to be able to do this. And now they're exporting it. So stuff like that. I think we've got to move beyond also running fossil fuel campaigns that are about just saying no. We have to talk about what the transition is and what we need and what's in place. But it's also just the angle of, you know, there are 14 Aboriginal remote communities engaged on the fracking campaign in the NT. And if we were just out there telling them, like, just say no to fracking, the realistic thing is like that money is going to walk away, and then you're still left with the issue of climate change. You're still left with the issue of no housing. There's no jobs here. Like, so we can't just run just fossil fuel campaigns and say no to them.
Yeah, well, that's the same in the work that I've been doing as well. Like any community, you can't just say no. It's like, well, every community is facing a whole lot of different issues. So how do we address them? How do we see the disruption at the moment as an opportunity to make things better, not just keep the status quo going? And then you're talking about remote Aboriginal communities are dealing with so many issues already. These things just exacerbate what's already difficult situation. So I'm hearing from everybody here, there's a real issue around the rules. So we've got a system that's set up. There's vested interests that would like to keep it the way it is because for all sorts of different reasons, but it's cheaper to keep going what is and make a lot of money out of it than to create something new. And then there's these alternatives that are popping up, but that actually requires a change to the system. So in that political sense, I guess then it's how do we engage with policymakers? And so how do we support the groups that are doing that work? So groups like SEED are really pushing the politics and doing that inside work and are really skilled up in knowing what policy to ask for and supporting groups on the ground. There's work that everybody can do as citizens around contacting the local MPs or keeping an eye out for when there are campaigns and submissions. So signing up to all of your groups, for example, so people know what's going on and when they need to write letters or do MP visits. What else? What else can people do on that political side of things, especially to support First Nations groups that are, like you said, there's so many different issues there. There's energy security issues, there's extraction issues and the impacts on communities, there's climate impacts already, there's land rights issues as companies come in and approach on that. So what else can people do if they wanted to support the efforts of groups on the ground?
So we, especially with the NT campaign, we've moved into campaigning against Origin, which is one of the biggest energy providers in the country. And the reason that we're doing that is we're basically getting a bunch of shareholders, customers and staff on board to force Origin to not only move away from their plans to frack in the Northern Territory, but to shift to renewable energy. And basically, we want them to divest from their entire fossil fuel portfolio. And stuff like that, like corporate campaigning has a role to play in this. Big energy providers have a role. We've seen the kind of impact we have on the big four banks and their climate commitments and what they will and won't invest in. And I think when governments let us down, we have to remember that they're not the only decision makers in the space. And like, there's a bunch of individual stuff that people can do around investing in their own renewable energy and all that sort of stuff. But so we're running a corporate campaign at the moment, which people can get involved in, take online action. And also turn out with Get Up. It's an alliance of groups, so we work with SEED and also Community Protect NT Alliance on the ground, and Original Power, which is another Aboriginal organisation. So it's an alliance of groups, and Lock the Gate. But we also are doing, this will go live next week, but if you sign up to any of our campaigns, you get an invitation. But we're doing a Power of Country tour that talks about traditional owners coming to the East Coast and talking about self-determination, land rights, what's really happening on the ground there for them, and actually how can people take action, because shareholders have been really important in raising issues around consent with Origin so far. So there's a bunch of things that will come out of that, but that's one thing to look out for.
Great. Okay, well, we might move on to questions. Actually, there were a few questions already sent in before the webinar. People are super keen. And one of them was actually about fracking. Let me just bring it up on my phone so I get it right. So we've got a question from Leanne Brummel, and she said she's working on a submission to stop a gas company fracking wells near Injune in Queensland. So what sort of evidence is useful that to make the point that the planet, we need to leapfrog gas, because at the moment there's a whole lot of discussion around gas being a transition fuel. It's better than burning coal, so we should just, invest in gas. So what evidence do we need to use to dispel that myth? She notes that health is good, but she was looking for advice around climate grounds.
Yeah, one of the reasons that we're doing the Protect Country tour is to kind of talk about that issue, which is the gas lobby kind of nailed, while the climate movement has been really looking at coal basins, how they talk about the gas, and they say like, oh, you can say coal is dirty, but they say, well, gas isn't as dirty and we need it in transition. It's a complete myth. We don't need gas in the transition. We don't need it at all. Also, the fact is that most of this gas that's coming out, gas is in oversupply. So the fact that we even need it in any way, shape or form is just a myth. And we need to do better. And there's a lot of reports that have been released that talk about that, but we actually need to get better to talk about the narrative. And that's one of the main objectives of the Power of Country tour, is to get people to understand how to talk about the fact that we don't need gas, and kind of not myth bust that, but just lead with like, we can just 100% renewables is doable. I think that Nikki could probably add more on that.
Or Giles, have you guys written much about gas in Renew Economy?
Oh, you go first. Oh, look, I was just going to say, no, we kind of avoid about fracking because we just think it's a bit of a joke. Look, fracking, as Larissa says, is well, the gas is probably not needed. We talked about South Australia before. I think the AEMO forecast for South Australia out to 2030, looking at a net 100% renewables, has gas providing maybe less than 10% of the grid's needs, and will probably end up being much lower than that, and that's compared to 40 or 50% now. So that's basically wind and solar. It's already pushed out coal, then it will push out gas. I mean, fracking is expensive. It's incredibly dirty. Unfortunately, a lot of its emissions are not measured because we simply don't take account of the methane released at the wellheads. and it's an intrusion onto country and to people's land. So you know, you go back a couple of years and people are talking about, oh, the golden age of gas will happen. Well, that's kind of been brushed aside now. We know it's not going to happen, but that doesn't stop the gas industry from still, you know, trying to play the game in Australia. They just basically want to get access to the common resource, which they describe it, and extract it and take the profit from it. But it's not really benefiting anyone by themselves. And even then, it doesn't work. I mean, BHP wrote off $20 billion from its failed fracking venture in the US. So, you know, sometimes it's not even good for the people investing in it.
Yeah, especially renewable energy is so much cheaper, and with the battery storage coming on, it's changing the game completely.
Yeah, battery and pumped hydro. Yeah.
So I did a there's a campaign to stop fracking in northwest New South Wales, and I was up giving a presentation around the clean energy alternatives to gas in that part of the world, and I've created a bit of presentation, and there's sort of 3 or 4 graphs that are pretty useful to illustrate the point that gas is not a transition fuel. So I'm really happy to share them. And, you know, send them around and tweet them or put them on social media as sort of some graphical examples around, you know, why this just isn't the case. Also, been working with SEED and Lock the Gate and also Environment Victoria to develop a couple of briefing papers around why fracking is so expensive and polluting. And I think that they're now available, so they could be circulated as well.
Yep, if you send me the links, we'll chuck it up on the website straight after the call.
Great.
Okay, another question. So, well, 2 questions actually around solar panel technology. So the first one was from Miles Lockhead. So talking about emerging evidence that solar panels are not working efficiently because of bad positioning, bad installment, or faulty. Is there a push, or could there be a push to ensure panel owners are made aware of their performance and getting the most benefit from their hardware? And there's a second question that's related, which is around the solar panel technology changing so fast. Is it worth investing? Because that is sometimes talked about as a barrier to investment. People are just waiting for prices to come down. So how well are they working, and how can people make sure they're getting the best buck out of their own, I guess, household solar? And the second question, Yep.
So solar's working really, really well when they're properly installed and they're in the proper place. It's fantastic technology. I wouldn't be waiting around for the next breakthrough in solar. I think you get as good a deal as you can probably now. I mean, maybe the costs will come down now, but you're getting such a great payback now that I wouldn't be delaying any further if you didn't need to. Yes, it's true that up to 20% of installations can be underperforming. We don't have much details about how much they're underperforming. That's kind of been the case for a while yet, and it's really sad to see. Now, there's been a lot of effort from the Clean Energy Council and the regulators to tighten the provisions. 1, they've clamped down on the sort of panels which are available. 2, they've tried to sort of clamp down and make sure that the people installing it are properly trained. Unfortunately, Australians like what they think is a bargain. And so too many Australians have just gone for the cheapest panels they could possibly find. And too often, these things are either badly installed or they're just completely duds of technology. Particularly cost cutting and cost saving in inverter technology is really bad. Some of these inverters, you know, don't work very long. So my advice, I've got a couple of pieces of advice. 1, don't take any offers from people knocking door to door or coming through on the phone, or people dropping things in letters. It'll be shonky. There's one thing that's going around at the moment, actually, on battery storage, offering people, oh, we're doing this trial, we're doing this testing period, we'll give you a battery at a big discount if you sign up for this. They did it last year with Enphase batteries. Now they're doing it with Alpha ESS batteries. It is a complete and utter scam. And I'm absolutely shocked about how many people quite sensible people ring up to me and say, oh, what do you think about this, Giles? I say, no, it is a scam. They're going to sell it to you at twice the price, and that trial probably doesn't exist. The third thing is,
how do people find out? How do people find out whether something's legit or not?
I can jump in there. So yeah, I think one of the things is, you know, this is a fairly new product and consumer product, you know, it's been around for decades, but as a mass consumer product, pretty new. Where do you go for trusted information around this? Well, Renew Economy and One Step Off the Grid is a great place, but the two other organisations that I often recommend people to are it's the Australian Energy Foundation, was called Moreland Energy Foundation, now rebranded as Australian Energy Foundation. They've got an advice service, and Renew, not to be confused with Renew Economy, but Renew, previously known as the Alternative Technology Association, are two great organisations that provide advice services. You might have to pay a little bit, but you know, if you don't want to spend the hours doing the shopping around online for good products, those are two places where I go for trusted information.
Cool. There's also a question about solar options for low-income people or renters from Patricia Winfield in Adelaide. Nikki, that's probably you again.
On that? Yeah. So this is an area that we at Community Power Agency have been working on for about 5 years. So there are about 4 or 5 different barriers to solar. One is, you know, you can't afford the upfront costs. The other is you rent and there's a split incentive with your landlord. You might have an unsuitable shaded roof or it's heritage listed, or maybe it's you live in an apartment and there's just not enough roof space. So for each of those different situations, there are different solutions available. So for the lack of being able to afford it, you could provide zero interest loans, and councils across Victoria are doing a rates financing program which enable you to get zero upfront solar and then pay back the cost of it through your council rates through an excess fee. If it's, you know, you live in an apartment, there are new technology looking at trying to do apartment microgrids that works sort of not in really high-rise apartments but on others. If you rent, if you're in Victoria again, there's a solar renter rebate available with the Victorian government, and there are also some social enterprise solutions that are okay, but they need some work. And then we've been working on this model called solar gardens, which is the idea of a centralized solar array, and you buy, you know, your 5 kilowatts in that centralized solar array. And then we partner with an electricity retailer and they credit the electricity on your bill. So it's like the solar is on your own roof, but you don't have to have a sunny roof that you own.
Like a community garden, you have your own bed.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you can't put you don't have a garden, you join a community garden, similar kind of situation. That's a model that works really well in the US, but where they've got policy support. In Australia, we're just still trying to prove it up. So one thing I want to recommend is where Community Power Agency is going to be launching a social media campaign called Solar for All on the 20th of August, and we can see a pathway to ensuring that every Australian household, no matter where they live, no matter what they earn, can access the benefits of clean energy directly. But it's going to need some policy support, so we're going to need to get active. So I'd invite people to keep your eyes peeled for the hashtag Solar for All campaign.
Great. Okay, now I've just got a whole lot of questions here and we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to pick and choose. Okay, this should be a quick one. Is there a website people can go to assist with choosing which energy providers who are moving towards renewables? So which are the greener providers, I guess, from Chris McElligott. Where do people find out?
Green Electricity Guide, that what it's called,
yep.
Giles?
I think so. I'm just trying to think of it myself, actually.
It's about 2 years old now, I think, but the Green Electricity Guide. By Total Environment Centre and Greenpeace.
Great. And regarding microgrids, what motivation is there to purchase a battery when energy network providers are not allowing households to go off the grid? From Tim Hayden, because that was a lot of the excitement originally with batteries, that people could just go off grid and just have their own energy. But are there other reasons to have battery installation?
I'd be surprised if any networks are telling people they can't go off the grid. That's a bit surprising. Please send me an email if you've been told you're not allowed to. No, you've got every choice of.
So people can go off the grid.
Oh, of course they can. Absolutely. Yeah. They
Is
were
that a good
actually
idea?
talking about individual. It might be if you're building a new house, for instance, in a regional area or even in a city area. Sometimes the cost of connection is so great, you might as well just build a battery and just look after yourself. I know lots of people in this area who are doing exactly the same thing. Some people want to get off the grid for a bunch of reasons. They're sort of, they want their independence. They may want their privacy. They may think it's an economic thing. There's actually really interesting people who live in some of these ones in the extended networks. You've got these little single lines. They go through forests, and it costs, I think, Essential Energy just said it cost them about $25,000 a year per kilometre to keep the branches off these lines. So it's absolutely, it's a ridiculous thing to do, is to keep these people connected. So that rule change that I was talking about before, that should encourage the networks to say, okay, this line is 20 kilometres long, it's going through a forest, there's 5 people there. What we're going to do is take down the line. It's much safer. It's not going to cause bushfires. It's going to reduce the outages, and we'll give you a battery, we'll give you solar, and we'll give you backup, and you guys can look after it yourself. So that hopefully will happen. But I'm very surprised to hear that people are being prevented from going off the grid. And I know they were talking about trying to do it, but they shouldn't be allowed.
I guess it's interesting the work that I think Nikki's been involved in, but also ACOS, Australian Council for Social Services, and QCOS, and a few other groups around, I guess, the issue around affordability. So some people, and that there's a potential inequality issue growing because some people can afford to move fast on getting solar panels and batteries, whereas not all households have the income to enable them to do that. So there is still the argument that I hear about still needing a grid because not everyone can afford or be able to manage that. What do you have to say to that?
Maybe can I jump in there? Which is to go, I think what we're going to have is a smarter grid. And I don't just mean that in terms of we're going to have internet coupled with poles and wires, which is traditionally, but we're going to be smart about where we have the grid. So we're going to have some more transmission lines and some big renewable energy zones where the sun shines the longest and the strongest and the wind blows the greatest. And then we're going to have some places where it just doesn't make sense to have big grid, long spindly lines out there anymore. And it makes sense to, enable communities and households and farms to be more energy self-sufficient through microgrids and others. So we're going to see bigger grid in some places and smaller grid in other places. And that's particularly because, if we are serious about acting on climate change, we not only need to decarbonise our electricity system, we also need to decarbonise transport and industry. And the best way to do that is to electrify industry and transport and power them with renewables. So, we're definitely still going to have a grid. It's not going to necessarily look like it has in the past. And they will make sense for a lot of people not to be connected to the grid anymore, or only to be connected to the grid sometime.
Great. Tim just responds to the question before about going off grid that you can't go, I think it's saying you can't go off the grid in Queensland urban areas with Energex. So it might be something to look up. Because I was under the impression we couldn't either, and I'm in Queensland based. So that's a question mark to look up. We're running out of time. We've only got a minute to go. So just to wrap up, so we've got lots of different technological options, and it's not the technology that's letting us down at the moment. It's actually the policy and the rules and that set things up to make things easy and also to be coordinated as well. But there's also keeping in mind the different social justice issues around affordability and access to infrastructure, where you live, geography can affect that, income, and there's certain groups like renters being able to or not able to access this, as well as people in remote communities. And then, as Larissa was saying, keeping in mind that this is not just one issue, there's actually a whole lot of different issues then impacting on First Nations, remote First Nations communities and other remote communities as well. And if we're talking about energy justice, it's linked to climate justice. Coming back though, that everyone's talked about really positive ways forward, and I like to encourage people to say, yes, this is a scary time, we're transitioning, we don't know what it's going to look like. But when there's this disruption, there's also an opportunity to build something new that actually works even better. And to do that, we need the people on this, people like the people on this call and the groups that they represent, really pushing for those solutions and doing that hard work behind the scenes to make that happen. So I want to thank you all for joining us on this call and the work that you all do, which is so important. And thank everyone for joining in and asking questions. Sorry, we didn't get through all the questions that were asked. But keep the conversation going on the Facebook site. That's the 2040 The Regeneration Facebook site, because people on the call who are listening in are also going to have a lot of these answers. So keep that conversation going. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and the next topic is going to be regenerating agriculture. So acting on climate change, reducing emissions, but also absorbing emissions, land use holds the key around that in lots of different ways. So we're going to talk about all the different ways how farming is changing, but other land use practices that can actually help us mitigate the impacts of climate change and help communities adapt. So thanks for joining us, and the recording will go up on the website. So please share it widely, and hope to see you all next time. Thank you. Bye.